The night of the company Christmas party, Maren stood near the windows on the 14th floor and watched Julian laugh. She had spent 3 weeks deciding whether to give him the book she'd wrapped in brown paper and string. Not a grand gesture. Just a worn copy of a novel she thought he'd like, with a note tucked inside that said nothing romantic, only, "You mentioned you'd been meaning to read this. Thought you might want it." She had crossed out 4 different versions of that sentence before settling on that one. He was surrounded by people the way he always was. Not because he sought attention, but because he had a kind of calm that drew others in, a steadiness that made people feel less anxious about things. Maren had watched it for 6 months now, from a careful distance that she told herself was professional. When the crowd around him thinned, she walked over. Her hands felt strange. She had held this book through 3 elevator rides and 1 bathroom stop to reconsider. "Julian." She said his name like it cost her something because it did. He turned and his face settled into the pleasant, slightly distracted expression of someone meeting a colleague they don't know well at a party. "Oh, hello. Sorry, I'm terrible with names at these things." The book in her hands suddenly weighed a great deal. "Maren," she said. "Maren Calloway. I work in the finance team. We've been in the same project meeting since June." "Right, of course, Maren." He smiled with genuine warmth, the kind you offer someone you're happy to meet for the first time. "Enjoying the party?" She gave him the book. She smiled. She said something she couldn't recall 5 minutes later. Then she walked back to the windows and stood there for a long time, watching the lights of Vancouver below, thinking about a porch in North Vancouver and a June night, and a boy who had once known, without being told, exactly how she took her tea. 7 years. She had waited 7 years, though she had never let herself call it waiting. Maren grew up in a narrow house on a hill in North Vancouver, the kind that needed its eavesdrows cleaned every autumn and had a back porch that tilted slightly to the left. Her father, Robert, was a good man who worked in marine equipment, until his joint started failing him in his mid-40s. What began as a stiff morning turned into something longer and more serious. By the time Maren was 15, he had left his job. By the time she was 16, the medical bills had started rearranging everything about how the family lived. Her mother, Alice, took on 2 jobs. She cleaned offices in the early morning and worked the counter at a bakery in Lynn Valley 3 afternoons a week. She did it without complaint, which Maren later understood was its own kind of grief, carrying something heavy without wanting anyone to notice the weight. They rented out the basement suite to help with the mortgage. It had a separate entrance off the carport and a window that looked out onto the back garden. Their previous tenant had moved to the island to be near his daughter. In early September, a new tenant moved in. His name was Julian Ashworth. He was 23, in his 2nd year of a business degree at UBC, and he had come from Sudbury, Ontario, knowing almost no one in the city. He paid on time, left his shoes neatly outside the door, and on his 3rd day in the suite, he fixed the dripping tap in the basement bathroom without being asked and left a polite note explaining what he'd done and that he hoped it was all right. Alice showed Maren the note at dinner. "I like him already," she said. Maren was 17. She was serious and quiet, and did not trust easily, which her parents had always attributed to a difficult year in middle school, and which was really just the way she was built. She noticed Julian in the way you notice weather. He was simply part of the household's atmosphere now, present and unremarkable in the day-to-day, except that he was not unremarkable at all once you paid attention. He went running before sunrise, even in November. He swept the carport without being asked. When Robert was having a hard week, Julian would come upstairs on some reasonable pretext. A question about the neighborhood, a borrowed pot, and end up sitting with him for an hour, talking about hockey or local history or whatever Robert wanted to talk about. Somehow that made Robert's difficult weeks feel less isolated. The tutoring started because of a failed test. Maren had come home from school with a mark she couldn't show her mother. Not because Alice would have been angry, but because Alice already had enough to carry. She sat at the kitchen table, going over the calculus questions and not understanding them in a way that felt circular and hopeless. Julian had come upstairs to return a dish. He set it on the counter, looked at the test on the table, and asked if she wanted him to walk through it with her. He said it as casually as if he were offering to hold a door, no big deal either way. She said yes. She didn't know why. She was not the kind of person who said yes easily. He pulled out a chair, and they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. He did not make her feel stupid, which was the thing she remembered most about that evening. He asked her how she was thinking about the problem before he told her where the thinking went wrong. By the end, she understood it. Not just the answer, she understood it. After that, he came upstairs on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Maren's mother left out tea. Robert sometimes appeared from the bedroom to listen for a while before going back to bed. Julian brought a hot chocolate from the Tim Hortons on his way home from class, without ever making a comment about it. He would just set it on the table in front of her, and sit down and open her textbook like that. Was simply how things went. She was always cold in the evenings, and she had never mentioned it. And he had never mentioned it either. She stopped calling him Mr. Ashworth after the third week. She started leaving half of whatever she was having for dinner on the landing outside his door when he came home late from studying. He would text their landline. They didn't have smartphones, a simple thank you, and she would find it written in her mother's handwriting on the message pad by the phone. In early spring, he asked her what she wanted to do after school. She shrugged in the way she did when she didn't want to admit to wanting something. Finance, she said finally. Something like that. Numbers make sense to me. People are harder. He looked at her with a seriousness that she felt in her sternum. You're good at it, he said. You should go for it. No one in Maren's world had ever said that to her, with that kind of matter-of-fact certainty, like it was simply an observation rather than an encouragement. She kept it. She kept it for years. June arrived the way it does in North Vancouver, suddenly, warmly, the city going green and soft overnight. Maren's father was having a better stretch. Julian had finished his exams. On a Thursday evening, they sat on the tilted back porch long after the tutoring session had wound up, because neither of them moved to go inside. The maple in the neighbor's yard was helicoptering seeds into the yard. One landed in Maren's hair and she didn't notice, and Julian reached over and took it out with 2 fingers, carefully, and held it out to show her. Their faces were close for a moment. She felt something shift in the way you feel the pressure change before rain. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They went back to talking about her plans for the summer, about what courses she'd take in September, about a documentary he'd watched about the salmon run in the Fraser Valley. But something had moved between them, some small tectonic thing, and she lay awake for a while thinking about it before she slept. 3 weeks later, at 4 in the morning, she heard the door to the basement suite open and close again. When she came downstairs in the morning, there was a note on the landing, scrawled on the back of a brown paper bag in handwriting that leaned with urgency. Maren, I had to go. My mom had an accident. I'm sorry for leaving so quickly. Take care of yourself. J. His key was beneath the note. She stood on the landing in her socks and read it 3 times. Then she went back upstairs, made her mother's tea, and didn't cry until she was in the shower where the sound was covered. He had gone. She understood why. She did not blame him for anything. But she was 17 years old, and he had picked a maple key out of her hair 3 weeks before, and she hadn't said the thing she might have said. And now he was gone, and she hadn't even given him the landline number. Autumn came, then winter he did not call. She put his textbooks on her desk and studied from them. His highlights and margin notes became a kind of language between herself and the absent version of him. Important he had written beside a formula in blue ink. Come back to this beside another. She came back to everything. By the time she was 25, Maren had a degree in business administration from UBC, a certificate in financial analysis, and a very small apartment in East Vancouver that she had furnished almost entirely from thrift shops. She had interviewed at 11 companies and received polite rejections from all of them. The problem, she was told in various diplomatic ways, was experience. She had none of the professional kind, though she had plenty of the other kind, the kind nobody asked for on a resume. She worked evenings at a restaurant near Main Street and spent her days applying to positions and studying for her CFA exams. She had not dated anyone in a way that stuck. There had been 2 people she'd tried to mean something to, and both times she had ended it, and she hadn't been fully able to explain to herself why, except that she kept measuring the feeling against something she couldn't name. In February, she applied to Meridian Capital Group, a mid-sized wealth management firm based in downtown Vancouver with a reputation for promoting from within. She sent her application without expecting much and tried not to think about it. They called back in a week. She started in March. The work was challenging but manageable. She was placed in a team of 6 analysts, and she kept her head down and her numbers clean, which was the best thing she knew how to do. A woman named Suki in the adjacent pod became something like a friend. They had lunch together most Tuesdays, and Suki understood that Maren communicated better in writing than in speech, which was a rare quality in a colleague. In September, 6 months after Maren started, the company announced the arrival of a new director of financial strategy. Someone from the Toronto branch, recently returned from 2 years in London. He would be overseeing the analytics division directly. The name in the company announcement was Julian Ashworth. Maren read the email once, then folded her laptop shut and sat very still for several minutes. It was a common enough name. She was being irrational. She went back to work. She saw him for the first time in the glass-walled boardroom on a Tuesday morning in October. She was presenting third-quarter projections to a room of 12 people she had worked with for months, and the door opened just as she was beginning, and he walked in and took the empty seat at the far end of the table. He was older. Of course he was older. So was she. There was a composure about him that hadn't been there before, something that came from having made enough decisions in enough rooms to stop being afraid of rooms. He had the same way of listening, that focused, still attention that made you feel the room had gotten quieter. He looked at her once during the presentation, directly, the way you look at a projection on a screen, receiving information. Afterward, when the others had filed out, he paused at the door. Strong work on those projections, especially the downside scenario. Who are you on the team? Maren Calloway, Analytics. Good eye for risk modeling. He nodded once and left. She stood in the boardroom alone for a moment. Then she went back to her desk and stared at her screen for a while before she could focus. Over the following weeks, she watched him the way she had once watched weather. He ran the division with the same quiet efficiency he had once applied to fixing a dripping tap. He learned everyone's names within the first 2 weeks. He remembered details. Someone's kid had been sick. Someone else was dealing with a difficult apartment situation. He didn't make a performance of caring. He simply retained things, and occasionally said something that showed he had retained them. He did not retain, apparently, anything about Maren. Small things happened that she couldn't entirely explain. On a cold morning in November, a Tim Hortons cup appeared on her desk. A medium hot chocolate, exactly the temperature she preferred, with no note and no clear origin. She asked Suki, who shrugged. She didn't ask anyone else. He assigned her the lead role in a complex infrastructure portfolio review that several more senior analysts had been avoiding. He sent the assignment directly to her email with a brief note. You're precise. This needs precision. At the firm's client appreciation evening in November, a man from one of the partner companies had been persistent with Maren in a way that was past the boundary of comfortable. Julian appeared from the other side of the room, not urgently, not dramatically, and simply inserted himself into the conversation with the smooth naturalness of someone who had somewhere to be. The man recalibrated immediately. Julian stayed until he wandered off, then said something unremarkable about the canapés and moved on. Maren spent a lot of November trying to decide what to believe. There was a woman named Tamara on the analytics team who had been at Meridian for 4 years and had expected to be considered for the director position herself. Tamara was capable and well-networked and not particularly unkind in ordinary circumstances, but the ordinary circumstances had changed. She began saying things in the kitchen and in meeting preambles that had the structure of observation and the function of erosion, noting that Maren's project assignments seemed unusually generous, suggesting with careful neutrality that it was interesting how certain people seemed to catch certain people's attention. Maren heard it. She understood what was being built. She said nothing, which was what she always did when she needed time to think. In January, the company held its winter retreat at a resort in Whistler. 2 days of team events, a client dinner on the second night, accommodations provided. Maren packed one bag and took the Sea to Sky Highway with the rest of the analytics group. On the second evening, Tamara came to find her near the fire pit with a glass of mulled wine. "Truce?" she said, and smiled in a way that was almost convincing. "I know I've been difficult. I want to do better." Maren accepted the glass, because she was not suspicious by nature and because she was tired, and because part of her still wanted things with Tamara to be repairable. Within 40 minutes, she understood that something was wrong. It came on gradually and then with a terrible speed, a spreading unreality, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire, her thoughts fragmenting at the edges. She set down her glass and stood carefully and started moving toward the lodge. The paths between the buildings were lit, but her depth perception was failing in unsettling ways. A man she didn't know appeared at her elbow. He said something about helping her to her room. His hand on her arm was wrong in a way she knew immediately, even through the haze. She pulled free. She pushed through the nearest door she could find. The number beside it read 214, and shoved it closed behind her and pressed her back against it. The room was lit by the bedside lamp. She was shaking and too hot, and the floor seemed slightly unreliable. Maren. Julian was sitting at the desk by the window, his jacket over the chair, a folder open in front of him. He crossed the room before she'd finished registering that he was there. She didn't remember much of the rest of that night clearly. She remembered him helping her to the chair. She remembered a cool cloth against her forehead. She remembered his voice, low and steady, saying, "You're safe. I've got you. You're safe." She woke in the first gray light of early morning. Julian was in the chair near the window, his legs stretched out and his head tilted back in the uncomfortable position of someone who had not meant to sleep but had. There was a glass of water on the nightstand. She sat up slowly. He woke. "How are you feeling?" His voice was careful. "What happened?" He told her what he suspected and what he was going to do about it. His voice was even and his jaw was not. Maren looked at the glass of water for a long moment. Then she said, "Why do you know how I take my coffee?" He was quiet. "You've never asked me, but the order is always right." She looked at him steadily. "You assigned me the infrastructure portfolio in October. The senior analysts had been passing it between them for 2 months. You gave it to a woman who'd been here since March. You were the best person for it. How did you know that?" She kept her voice level because the alternative was something she wasn't ready for. "You'd watched me for 3 weeks. He was quiet again, longer this time. "The night before I started here," she said, "I got an email confirming my start date. I never understood why I got the job. My CV was thin. I had no senior references. There were candidates with 5 more years of experience." She looked at him. "You pulled my file." It wasn't a question. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the mountain and the blue-gray dawn coming over it. Then he turned around. "My mother had an accident. That was true. I left at 4 in the morning, and I had nothing, no time, no clarity. I wrote that note on the only paper I could find." He exhaled slowly. "When I came back to North Vancouver 3 months later, the house had been sold. I didn't have your phone number. I didn't know your mother's last name. You'd mentioned your father was unwell, but I didn't know." He stopped. "Dad died that October," Maren said. A silence settled between them. "I know," he said quietly. "I found out later. I'm sorry." "How did you find out?" "I went looking." He said it simply. "Over the years, I knew your first name and the street. That's not much. It took time." He looked at her steadily. "When I came back to take this position, I asked to see all the analyst applications. Your name was in the stack. I nearly missed it. You'd used your full name, Maren, not Wren, the way you used to." He stopped again. The room was very quiet. "You knew," she said. "Yes." "For 6 months." "Yes." "And you said nothing." He pressed his hands flat on the desk. "My father had arranged something. A professional connection that had become a family expectation. It sounds archaic, and it was. I needed to end it properly, not impulsively. I needed to be able to come to you without dragging something unresolved behind me." He met her eyes. "I wasn't going to appear in front of you again, saying, 'Remember me?' and leave you holding the uncertainty the way you'd held it before." Maren breathed in slowly. "I kept your bicycle," she said. He blinked. "You left your old bike. I rode it to UBC for 3 years." She felt something loosen in her chest, not relief yet, but the beginning of it. "I studied from your highlighted notes, every margin comment. I used your calculus notation for years because it was slightly more efficient than what my professors taught." He sat down on the edge of the desk and put his face in his hands for just a moment briefly, in the way of someone managing something large. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When everything was settled, I was going to ask if you remembered a night on a porch in June and a maple key. You picked it out of my hair." "I did." "And you said nothing then, either." "I was 23 and I was leaving for exams and I was..." He paused. "Yes, I said nothing." They sat in the quiet for a while, the mountain getting lighter outside the window. Tamara resigned before she could be terminated. The security footage from the retreat was clear enough that there was little to dispute. A formal complaint was filed regarding the man in the corridor. Suki, who had also seen things she hadn't known how to name, gave a statement that helped. The colleague who had been spreading rumors quietly apologized to Maren, In the kitchen one Wednesday morning, Maren thanked her and poured her coffee and said nothing else about it, which was worse, probably, than anything she could have said. Maren went home to North Vancouver the following weekend. Her mother, Alice, was in the kitchen making lamb stew, and her grandmother, Edna, was at the table working on a crossword and complaining about the clue for 11 across, which she was fairly certain was wrong regardless of what the answer turned out to be. There was a knock at the front door on Sunday afternoon. Maren opened it. Julian stood on the step, holding a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks over, the same bakery where Alice had worked years ago. He looked slightly nervous in a way she had never seen in him before. "I thought I should probably not wait any longer," he said. Her mother took one look at the situation and invited him in for tea in the tone of voice that brooked no argument. Edna looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Well, you're very tall," which was her primary observation about most new people and not necessarily a criticism. He stayed for 4 hours. He ate 2 bowls of stew. He listened to Edna explain why 11 across was a bad clue with the same patient attention he had once given to Robert's opinions about the Canucks. Before he left, he carried the recycling to the bin at the end of the carport without being asked. Maren's mother appeared beside her at the kitchen window as they both watched him do this. "That one," Alice said simply, and went back to the dishes. The maple in the neighbor's yard had grown taller in 7 years. Everything grows eventually. Maren walked to the park near the old house. On a Sunday evening in early November, the way she had done on and off for years, when she needed to think, when she needed to remember something she was afraid of losing. Julian had asked if she wanted company, and she had said yes, which was still, even now, not something she said easily. They sat on the bench near the center path, the one that tilted very slightly to the right, and the maples were releasing their seeds in the late afternoon light. One landed in Maren's hair. She felt it. She left it. Julian reached over and took it out with 2 fingers, carefully, the way he had done once before. He held it out. She took it and looked at it in her palm. "I should have said something that night," he said, on the porch. I would have said." "I know," she said. "I want to stop not saying it." She looked at him. He was already on one knee in the November leaves, which was not something she had anticipated, and he was holding something small. A ring, simple, a narrow gold band, with a single stone, nothing performative, exactly what she would have chosen. His expression was not the expression of someone doing a thing for an audience. It was the expression of someone who had waited long enough, and finally understood that waiting was over. "Maren," his voice was steady but only just, "will you let me stop leaving?" She pressed the maple key into his free hand and closed his fingers around it. She nodded so many times before she found words that she stopped counting. The wedding was small. Alice's backyard in June, 30 people, a borrowed arch of white flowers, Edna dancing with the vigor of someone half her age, and the coordination of someone who had stopped caring what anyone thought. The dinner ran long. Stories were told that will be repeated for years. When Julian took Maren's hand and they stepped out through the back door into the yard, the neighbor's maple was raining its helicoptering seeds across both properties indiscriminately, the way it always had, and always would. She caught one. She kept it. Because some things know, without being told, exactly where they were always meant to land.